Agriculture and fishing in the United States have taken huge hits because of the coronavirus. With restaurants forced to close, Iowa farmers saw the demand for their pigs plummet. And with fewer animals being bred, grain suppliers are also seeing their bottom lines hugely affected. The Gulf Coast fishing industry is also struggling to stay afloat as famous seafood restaurants are going under. With us now, two CBS News campaign reporters, Tim Perry and Jack Turman. They've been doing excellent reporting, chronicling what has changed in the lives of residents in some of the biggest battleground states in 2020 during the ongoing pandemic. Guys, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Tim, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Louisiana has experienced more than its fair share of crises in recent years. Hurricanes Katrina, Gustav, the BP oil spill back in 2010. How is COVID-19 the same in some ways and also different?
Thank you for having me. So I think that one thing that we should put in perspective when we talk about how these industries have been affected is that this has been mainly an economic impact, right? Louisiana is nearing 45,000 cases of COVID-19, and there have been about 3,000 deaths. And so when you look at the fishing industry, there have been mainly economic impacts. And something that fishermen and fish processing people tell me often is that a lot of these problems have been kind of gradually happening, and COVID, like it has with many other issues, has kind of exacerbated the problems. And so to your point, they say that Hurricanes Katrina and Gustav and even the BP oil spill back in 2010 both had very terrible impacts on the industry. But what's different now is the closure of restaurants throughout the entire state means that they have absolutely no business. And so they are making absolutely no money. I spoke to one oyster processor, a guy who owns an oyster processing company, who says in April he only sold about 2% of what he normally sells. And that's just something that he can't sustain. And when you talk to people who own these restaurants that you spoke about in the introduction, they've had to lay off workers because their restaurants have gone from dine-in to curbside. And if you've been in New Orleans, for example, you know that that's just not a way for a restaurant in the city to function. And also coupled with the fact that COVID-19 began affecting these communities in March and April, which is about the busiest time of the year for a city like New Orleans. And you had all the cancellations of festivals like Jazz Fest, Essence Festival. A lot of that tourism that normally happens in the state is now non-existent because of COVID. And so these restaurants aren't buying the amount of seafood that they normally would buy, therefore making it impossible for these companies to make the money that they've been making normally.
So, Tim, how are the people there then adapting?
Well, they're being very resourceful at the moment. I spoke to a woman who runs a restaurant in New Orleans who's kind of paired with a vendor who builds tents for weddings, and they're now putting tents outside of the restaurant to make sure customers can still have some type of a dine-in experience, not the normal, typical one that would normally happen. And I spoke to some people who were selling oysters and shrimp and other types of fish in the state, and they typically sell wholesale, and there's normally a middleman like these restaurants that serve people their seafood. But now they're being creative and creating different types of fish markets throughout the city, and places where people can actually come in and buy fish themselves without having to go through a middleman. But I think one thing that concerns a lot of people is, two things that concern people. The first is, as the city begins to gradually open up, the city is now entering its slow period. It's when hurricane season starts. It's when tourism normally starts to die down, and they won't be able to make back the money that they originally thought that they would. Another thing that is becoming more and more concerning for a lot of these people is the fact that some experts are warning that COVID could very well come back in the fall. And that uncertainty is very scary for a lot of people. You have to remember the restaurant industry employs the most amount of people in the state. And with people not being able to work and with people not coming in to buy food, presents a challenge for some of these restaurants. And in particular, restaurants don't normally go bankrupt. They normally just close down. And so you have generations and generations of restaurant owners who are worried that if another pandemic comes through, they won't be able to survive.
One storm that they might not be able to weather. Jack, I want to turn to you now. You've been speaking to hog farmers in the Midwest. We have been talking extensively about some of the problems facing the demand and supply chain there, particularly with the processing plants. What are farmers now being forced to do?
Yeah, that's right. With meat processing plants closing due to COVID-19 outbreaks amid their own employees, it's been really hard financially for hog farmers, especially in Minnesota, which currently ranks second in hog production in the country. But there's also a huge emotional toll that some of these farmers have to go through. Mike Patterson, for example, who's a hog farmer, told me that he's part of a co-op with a dozen other families, and the co-op had to go through the tough decision of euthanizing 3,400 healthy pigs. Patterson estimated that's about $500,000. He did a lot to try to save the lives of these pigs by looking at empty barn space, by modifying the diets of these pigs to essentially slow their weight gain so they could hit their target weight. Dave Mensink, for example, is another farmer who said he hasn't had to euthanize pigs, but he's also looking for empty barn space, and it's a huge emotional strain. And Mensink told me that this is the last thing a farmer wants to do. They invested in the pig, raised the pig, and then for the pig not to go to market is a huge emotional strain for them. And for Mensink in particular, it's a huge financial strain as well. He told me that based off the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, he's losing $22 to $26 per pig over the next 12 months, and he projects that's around $160,000 to $182,000 of projected revenue loss. So coupled with the financial strain, there's also that emotional strain that we talked about. And, in addition to hog farmers, soybean and corn farmers have also been financially hit by this as well, especially when it comes to, local ethanol plants and biodiesel plants closing. So, it's not just hog farmers, it's also soybean and corn farmers as well.
It seems so extreme and really dire. I'm wondering, Jack, if you can tell me, when you've been talking to these Midwest farmers, they have been courted, particularly in elections in years past, by both Republicans and Democrats. Is what's happening right now having an effect on how they're going to approach the ballot box in November?
That's, still to be determined. But, if you look at the situation, like you said, it's super dire. And the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has received $11 million in COVID-19 state relief funds to help with the disposal of hogs and turkeys. But just looking at the situation and the economic strain, the financial strain for farmers, it's still to be determined on how they'll approach the ballot box and vote this upcoming November. But I will say that a lot of the farmers that I did talk to, they were very optimistic about the Phase 1 China trade deal that the Trump administration and the Chinese government agreed to in January. And the Chinese government was supposed to buy billions of dollars of agricultural products, including hogs, soybeans, and corn. But the COVID-19 is just the latest blow in what they said was a struggling agricultural economy. Some mentioned African swine fever that happened a few years ago, and then they also brought up the ongoing trade war and their ability to sell their products, crops, livestock to market has been hindered by retaliatory tariffs, they say. And there was optimism because a deal was made with China, but just like Jamie Beyer said, who's a soybean farmer, told me, she said, just like overnight, because of coronavirus, it's basically gone. It's cast a long shadow over that trade deal. And the main takeaway in this struggling agricultural economy that the farmers told me is that they just want their markets open. They want to have the ability to sell their products and profit off of that.
All right, Tim Perry, Jack Turman, thank you.